This is a book about poetry and the people who read it. So far as possible, the poets have been left out. People blather on far too much about poets and their lives and their childhoods and their educations and their houses and their portraits and the details of the private lives, which were at best boring and at worst immoral. The poetry is the most important thing, and the people that it was written for, the people who read it and recited it and copied it out and enjoyed it. After all, the poems that are now considered great are merely the ones that people have been enjoying for centuries. Chapter 1. The First English Poem. It has been said that poetry comes from pain. But English poetry comes from somewhere far worse. English poetry comes from France. It arrived in about 1370. The first English poem was called The Book of the Duchess. It wasn't, to be honest, the best poem in the world. Christopher Columbus wasn't, to be honest, the best European to visit America. But he was the first, and that makes him interesting. Technically, of course, Christopher Columbus wasn't the first European to visit America. The Vikings had paddled over there long before. But we don't count them, because their voyages didn't lead to anything. They went, came back, and were promptly forgotten about. But Columbus started something. He started a long, unbroken chain of trade and colonization. So, if you want to trace the history of Europeans in America, you trace it back to him. And the Vikings don't amount to much. There were poems written in English before the Book of the Duchess. There were Anglo-Saxon poems, which were usually about drizzle and death, and alliterative, incomprehensible medieval poems about owls, nightingales, and cuckoos. But, like the Vikings in America, they didn't lead to anything. There is a tradition of English poetry, and you can trace it slowly back from the present day to the 1370s and the Book of the Duchess. If you follow that tradition any further back, you end up on the far side of the English Channel. When the Book of the Duchess appeared, all previous English poetry was forgotten. All the rest starts here. And the Book of the Duchess is basically French. France back then was the centre of all that was refined, all that was noble and chivalrous, and all that was fashionable. Every French aristocrat kept a court, and that court was full of courtiers who were courteous and full of courtesy. They had courtly entertainments that were the pinnacle of fashion, and one of these entertainments, the one we're interested in, was reading out long narrative poems. Very, very, very long narrative poems. For example, in the 1380s, Gaston III, Count of Foix, wanted something to entertain his court over the long winter evenings, so he commissioned a poet called Jean Froissart to write a long narrative poem that would last all winter. The poem was called Méliador. Every night for 10 weeks, Froissart would arrive at the castle after supper. There he would find the Count and all his knights and squires gathered together, and he would sit and read out a new episode of his vast story. We know about this reading in detail because Froissart himself wrote about it. He was particularly proud that, on this occasion, nobody was allowed to speak during the reading except the Count himself. Nobody dared to say a word because he, the Count of Foix, wanted me to be well understood, wherein he took great pleasure, and when it came to any matter of question, then he would speak to me. Froissart was reading aloud, but that wasn't because the knights and squires were illiterate. They could all read themselves, but they chose not to. Reading on your own was considered a bit weird at the time. It was approximately like going to the cinema alone today.